Brock Mitchell had survived war zones, eyed blasts, and watching good men die. But losing his grandfather's ranch? That was the one fight he couldn't seem to win. The bills were final. The bank was circling. And even Kaiser, the war dog who once dragged him from the rubble, was slipping deeper into his own nightmares. Then the bull showed up. Not tagged. Not branded. Just there, standing in the mist like some ghost of the land itself. Massive, untouchable, watching. Brock thought he was hallucinating until the bull began showing up every morning, same time, same spot, scraping at the ground like he was digging for something. And when Brock finally followed, what the bull uncovered beneath that pasture wasn't just bones. It was evidence. And suddenly, Brock wasn't the one being hunted. He was about to expose the lie that almost buried his family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bills scattered across Frank Mitchell's old oak desk told a story Brock didn't want to read. Electric company, 3 months overdue. Feed supplier, payment required before next delivery. Bank notice, final warning before foreclosure proceedings. 6 months since he'd inherited the ranch, and the numbers painted a picture clearer than any morning fog rolling over the San Francisco Bay Hills. Brock Mitchell rubbed his weathered hands across his face, feeling every one of his 32 years in the ache behind his eyes. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky hung gray and heavy, promising the kind of weather that made cattle nervous and bills impossible to pay. The ranch his grandfather had built from nothing was slipping through his fingers like water. Through a broken dam, a truck backfired somewhere down the valley road. The sound cracked through the morning air like artillery. Fire. Kaiser hit the floor. The German Shepherd's 100-pound frame slammed against the hardwood, paws scrambling for purchase as his body pressed low, seeking cover that existed only in memories of Afghan desert compounds. His dark eyes went wide with that particular brand of terror reserved for those who'd seen too much, heard too much, survived too much. Easy boy. Brock's voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd talked plenty of soldiers down from the edge. He didn't move from his chair, didn't reach out. Touch could be threat when the ghosts were this close. Just a truck. You're safe. But Kaiser wasn't hearing him. The dog's breathing came in short, sharp pants as he army crawled toward the space between the refrigerator and the wall. His favorite hiding spot, the place where no one could sneak up behind him, where his back was protected and his escape routes clear. Brock waited. Time moved differently when the past crashed into the present. Like this, minutes felt like hours, but rushing never helped. He'd learned it the hard way. In dusty forward operating bases where the wrong word could send a good soldier over the edge permanently. The morning he'd found Kaiser 3 years ago replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't shut off. The I'd had gone off at 0630 hours, turning their Humvee into twisted metal and taking Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Johnson with it. Kaiser had found him in the rubble, bleeding from a dozen cuts, left leg mangled, consciousness fading fast. The dog had stayed with him for 6 hours, lying across his chest to keep him warm, barking whenever insurgents got too close, until the medevac finally arrived. They'd both come home broken in different ways. The hiding usually lasted an hour, sometimes 2. Brock had tried everything the Army doc suggested: desensitization training, anxiety medication, even one of those fancy animal therapists in San Francisco who charged $200 to tell him what he already knew. Kaiser had PTSD, same as half the soldiers Brock had served with. The difference was, Kaiser couldn't talk about it. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Through the screen door, he could see a woman in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, veterinary bag in hand. Dr. Celine Blake, according to the business card she'd left on his doorstep last month, along with a note. about providing affordable livestock care to local ranchers. He'd ignored the card. Couldn't afford affordable, let alone whatever passed for reasonable in the Bay Area, Mr. Mitchell? Her voice carried the kind of gentle authority that came from years of dealing with frightened animals and skeptical farmers. I'm here about the calf. What calf? Brock opened the door, stepping onto the porch to avoid letting Kaiser's distress become a spectator sport. Up close, Dr. Blake had the kind of steady eyes that missed nothing. She was already looking past him toward the sound of panting coming from inside the house. I don't recall calling about any calf, he said. You didn't. Ariana Harris did. She shifted the bag to her other hand, not backing down despite his less than welcoming tone. She's been watching your herd from her property. Said one of your calves has been favoring its left front leg for 3 days. Ariana Harris, his grandfather's neighbor and closest friend, who'd been bringing casseroles and unsolicited advice since the funeral. The woman who somehow knew about every ranch problem. Before he did. Mrs. Harris needs to mind her own business. Maybe. Dr. Blake's expression didn't change. But the calf still needs attention. Untreated lameness can lead to permanent damage, infection, even loss of the animal. Given that each calf represents roughly $1,500 in potential income, I'd say it's worth a look. She'd done her homework. Knew his financial situation without him having to spell it out like some charity case. Still, pride was about all he had left these days. What's this going to cost me? Farm call fee is $50. If it's something simple like a stone bruise or minor cut, that's all you'll pay. If it needs treatment, we'll discuss options. She paused, tilting her head toward the house. Is your dog all right? I can hear him breathing pretty hard in there. The question caught him off guard. Most people either pretended not to notice Kaiser's episodes or stared like he was some kind of circus act. Dr. Blake just sounded concerned. He's fine, just adjusts poorly to loud noises. She nodded like that made perfect sense. Combat veteran? We both are. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity, exactly. Understanding, maybe. There are therapies that can help working dogs with trauma responses. I've had good results with. He's not a working dog anymore. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. And I'm not looking for therapy recommendations. She held up one hand in surrender. Fair enough. How about we focus on the calf for now? 20 minutes later, they stood in the pasture watching Brutus work his way through the herd, with the kind of quiet authority that reminded Brock of his grandfather. The massive Hereford bull moved among the cattle like a general inspecting troops, his presence calming the nervous animals, his gentle nature belying his 2,000-pound frame. That's a beautiful bull, Dr. Blake said, pulling on latex gloves. As she approached the limping calf, hand raised. My grandfather bottle-fed him from birth. His mother died in a difficult delivery. Brock watched Brutus position himself between the stranger and the rest of the herd, protective but not aggressive. Brutus has been leading this herd for 3 years now. They trust him. Dr. Blake worked quickly and efficiently, her hands sure and gentle as she examined the calf's leg. Stone caught between the toes, she announced, using a hoof pick to extract a piece of gravel. Nothing serious, but it would have gotten infected if left untreated. As she cleaned and treated the minor wound, Brock found himself studying her technique. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from real experience, not just textbook knowledge. The calf stood still for her, sensing somehow that she meant no harm. You grew up around cattle, he said. It wasn't a question. Harris Ranch, about 5 miles east of here. My family ran cattle for 4 generations before we lost the place. She finished bandaging the calf's hoof and straightened, peeling off the gloves. Bank foreclosure. Bad drought year, bad cattle. Prices, bad timing all around. The parallel wasn't lost on him. When? 7 years ago. I was finishing vet school at UC Davis on student loans and prayers. She packed her supplies with practiced efficiency. My father always said the land teaches you everything you need to know about life. Sometimes that lesson is about letting go. From the house came the sound of the screen door opening. Kaiser appeared on the porch, his body language cautious but no longer panicked. He'd managed to pull himself together, though his ears remained pinned back, alert for threats. Dr. Blake noticed him immediately. German Shepherd, working dog. Explosive detection and search and rescue. He's beautiful. How long since you've been back? 3 years. Brock called Kaiser over with a low whistle. The dog approached slowly, keeping Brock between himself and the stranger. Some days are better than others. For both of you, I guess. She was too perceptive by half. Brock focused on Kaiser, running his hands through the dog's thick coat, feeling the tension still coiled in the animal's muscles. What do I owe you? $50, like I said. She handed him a business card. But I meant what I said about therapy options for Kaiser. There's a program in Santa Rosa that specializes in working dogs with combat trauma. The veterinarian who runs it is a former Marine. She understands. Brock pocketed the card without looking at it. $50 was $50 he didn't have, but it was better than losing a calf. Thanks for coming out. Anytime. Dr. Blake climbed into her battered pickup truck, then rolled down the window. Mr. Mitchell, the Weather Service is calling for a significant storm system to move through this weekend. First real cold snap of the season. You might want to make sure your cattle have adequate shelter. She drove away, leaving dust and the scent of antiseptic in the air. Brock watched her taillights disappear down the valley road, then looked up at the gray sky that seemed to be pressing lower by the hour. Kaiser leaned against his leg, the contact grounding them both in the present moment. Together, they stood in the pasture where Frank Mitchell had taught a young boy about responsibility, compassion, and the sacred trust between humans and the animals in their care. The bills on the kitchen table weren't going anywhere. Neither were the ghosts that haunted their sleep. But the cattle needed shelter, the calf needed monitoring, and storm clouds were gathering over Northern California with the promise of challenges that would test everything they thought they knew about survival. Winter was coming, and neither man nor dog was ready for what it would bring. Dr. Celine Blake returned 3 days later without invitation, her pickup truck crunching up the gravel drive at precisely 9 in the morning. Brock watched from the kitchen window as she unloaded her veterinary bag with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown during her first visit. This time, Kaiser didn't hide when she knocked. "I'm here for a follow-up on the calf," she announced when he opened the door, though her eyes were already studying Kaiser's relaxed posture beside him. "How's the lameness?" "Gone, completely healed." Brock stepped onto the porch, Kaiser following without the trembling that had marked their last encounter. "You didn't need to drive all the way out here for that. Professional thoroughness." She smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. "Besides, I brought something that might interest you both." From her truck, she retrieved a worn leather journal and a thermos that smelled like heaven. "Coffee," she explained, catching his expression. "And my grandfather's ranch records from the 1970s. He documented every storm that hit this valley for 40 years. Thought you might want to see what we're up against." She'd done it again. Offered help disguised as casual conversation, making it impossible for pride to interfere. Brock found himself accepting the coffee and following her to the pasture fence where they could watch the herd while she flipped through yellowed pages. "Here," she pointed to an entry dated February 1978. Unprecedented snowfall. Lost power for 6 days. Emergency shelter saved 30 head when Murphy's barn collapsed under snow load. Your grandfather helped organize the community response. Frank Mitchell had never mentioned that storm, but Brock could picture it. His grandfather had never been one to boast about helping others. He just did what needed doing. The Weather Service is calling this system unprecedented too, Celine continued, her voice carefully neutral. Ariana Harris has been organizing preparation meetings with all the local ranchers. Tomorrow night at her place, she asked me to invite you. Before he could refuse, a familiar border collie came trotting across the pasture. Bella, his grandfather's dog, now 4 years old and the smartest animal on the ranch. She approached Kaiser with the kind of patient understanding that came from a lifetime of reading other animals' moods. Kaiser's tail gave a tentative wag, the first Brock had seen in months. She knows, Celine observed softly. Dogs understand trauma in ways humans never will. She's offering to be his anchor. As if responding to her words, Bella settled beside Kaiser, close enough to provide comfort without crowding. The German shepherd's breathing steadied, his hyper-vigilant posture relaxing incrementally. There's a program I mentioned, Celine said, her attention seeming focused on the dogs while her real message was for Brock. The veterinarian who runs it trains therapy dogs specifically to help other animals with PTSD, combat veterans, rescue animals, livestock who've experienced trauma. The success rate is remarkable. Kaiser's not ready for programs, maybe not, but Bella is. She closed the journal and looked at him directly. Sometimes healing happens in pairs. Sometimes we need to help others before we can help ourselves. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the Pacific, dark and heavy with the promise of challenges neither of them could fully imagine. But here in the pasture, watching Kaiser lean slightly against Bella's solid warmth, Brock felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the possibility of hope. The emergency broadcast crackled through the radio at 5:47 a.m., jolting Brock from uneasy sleep. National Weather Service has issued a blizzard warning for the North Bay Hills. Unprecedented snowfall expected, with accumulations of 3 to 5 feet possible. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour. This is a life-threatening weather event. Kaiser was already at the bedroom door, ears pricked forward, body tense but focused. The dog's military training had kicked in during the night, transforming anxiety into purposeful alertness. Crisis meant mission. Mission meant Kaiser had work to do. Outside, the sky hung low and steel gray, pregnant with the kind of storm that old-timers talked about in hushed voices. The air carried that peculiar stillness that preceded violence, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. Brock's phone buzzed. A text from Celine, on my way, bringing emergency supplies. Another, from Ariana Harris, community shelter protocol is in effect. Your grandfather's emergency plan is in the red folder, kitchen drawer. We're all here if you need us. The red folder. Brock had seen it 100 times but never opened it, assuming it contained outdated insurance papers or tax documents. Now, he pulled it from the drawer with reverent hands, finding 40 years of meticulous planning written in Frank Mitchell's careful script. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Winter Emergency Protocol, the first page read. When you can't change the weather, you change everything else. Maps showed cattle evacuation routes. Supply lists detailed everything from medical supplies to emergency feed. Most importantly, a hand-drawn diagram showed how to convert the main barn into a storm shelter capable of housing the entire herd. His grandfather had thought of everything. Kaiser paced the kitchen, his gait purposeful rather than anxious. The approaching crisis had awakened something in him that months of peaceful ranch life had left dormant. He moved to the window, scanning the horizon with the systematic thoroughness of a trained scout. You remember this, don't you? Brock asked softly. Emergency prep, getting ready for the worst. The dog's tail gave a single sharp wag. Acknowledgement, understanding. For the first time since coming home, Kaiser looked like the professional he'd once been. Celine's truck appeared through the pre-dawn gloom, headlights cutting through air so thick it seemed solid. She'd loaded the bed with hay bales, water containers, and medical supplies. When she climbed out, her expression carried the same focused intensity that marked Kaiser's transformation. "How bad?" Brock asked. "Bad enough that every veterinarian in 3 counties is coordinating emergency response." She began unloading supplies with military efficiency. The storm's tracking differently than anything in recorded history. Pacific moisture hitting an Arctic air mass over land that's not equipped for this kind of weather. They worked in wordless synchronization, converting the barn according to Frank's diagrams. Kaiser moved among them like a professional, anticipating needs, positioning himself where he could monitor both the work and the surrounding area. When Bella arrived to help, he accepted her presence without the usual wariness, understanding instinctively that crisis required all available resources. By noon, Ariana Harris had arrived with 2 neighbors, their faces grim but determined. The community that had watched Frank Mitchell build his legacy was rallying to preserve it. They brought chainsaws, generators, and the kind of unspoken solidarity that rural people understood without explanation. "Your grandfather saved my cattle in the storm of '78, said Jim Carlson, a weathered man in his 60s. "Opened his barn when mine flooded, shared his feed when supply trucks couldn't get through. Time to return the favor." As afternoon faded toward evening, the first fat snowflakes began to fall. The cattle sensed the approaching danger, clustering together in nervous groups, their usual calm shattered by atmospheric pressure drops and electromagnetic changes that humans could barely detect. Brutus moved among them like a general rallying troops, his massive presence calming the smaller animals, his gentle nature providing anchor points of stability in rising chaos. The bull positioned himself strategically, creating psychological barriers between the most nervous cattle and the growing storm. "He knows," Celine observed, watching Brutus guide a panicked heifer toward the shelter. "Animals understand weather in ways we've forgotten. He's trying to keep them together." The wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying the sharp bite of genuine cold. Power lines swayed ominously, and the first communication towers began flickering with instability. Soon, each ranch would be isolated, cut off from outside help, dependent entirely on preparation and the ancient human ability to endure what nature delivered. Kaiser stood at the barn entrance as the last of the cattle were secured, his silhouette outlined against the growing storm. Behind him, 47 head of livestock huddled in the warmth and safety that community effort had provided. Ahead, the blizzard gathered strength with each passing hour. For the first time since Afghanistan, dog and man faced a crisis together. Their bond strengthened by shared purpose and the knowledge that survival depended on everything they'd learned about duty, sacrifice, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The storm had arrived, and they were as ready as anyone could be for something unprecedented. The lightning came without warning at 2:17 a.m., a brilliant flash that turned the world white and sent 47 head of cattle into immediate panic. Thunder followed instantly, a bone-deep rumble that shook the barn's foundation and triggered every trauma response Kaiser had spent 3 years trying to forget. But this time was different. This time, Kaiser didn't hide. The German shepherd launched himself toward the chaos as cattle scattered in terror, their careful shelter arrangement dissolving into a stampede of hooves and fear. In the strobing darkness between lightning strikes, Brock could see massive shapes careening toward the barn doors, seeking escape from the enclosed space that had suddenly become a trap rather than sanctuary. "The gates!" Celine shouted over the thunder, wrestling with a panicked heifer that had knocked her against a support post. "They're going to break through." Brock dove for the main gate mechanism, but he was too late. Brutus, in his instinct to protect the smaller animals, had positioned himself at the front of the herd when the lightning struck. Now the 2,000-pound bull was leading a terrified exodus into the howling blizzard. his gentle nature overwhelmed by the primal need to flee from perceived danger. "Brutus!" Brock's voice was lost in the wind as cattle poured through the breached gates like water through a broken dam. "Brutus, come back!" But the bull was gone, swallowed by swirling snow so thick it erased the world beyond 10 feet. Behind him, the rest of the herd followed their leader into the white void, their survival instincts overriding months of careful training. Kaiser appeared at Brock's side, his body vibrating with the need to pursue, to rescue, to complete the mission. His dark eyes tracked the cattle's path into the storm, calculating distances and possibilities with the precision of a trained professional. "No!" Brock grabbed Kaiser's collar, feeling the dog's muscles coil for action. "It's suicide out there. We can't see 5 feet." Another lightning flash revealed the scope of the disaster. 30 head of cattle had fled into conditions that would kill humans in minutes. The remaining 17 huddled in the barn's corner, too terrified to move, their eyes reflecting the emergency lanterns in wild, white-rimmed terror. Celine was already moving among the remaining animals, checking for injuries, her veterinary training taking over despite the chaos. "3 broken through the south wall," she called out. "Minor cuts, nothing life-threatening. But the ones outside ... She didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what sub-zero temperatures and 70-mile-per-hour winds would do to animals. Caught in the open, Brock's radio crackled with static and broken transmissions. Ariana Harris's voice came through in fragments. ... Lost 6 head ... Communications. Down ... Roads impassable ... Double quotes. Then nothing but white noise as the storm overwhelmed the relay towers. "We have to go after them," Brock said, pulling on his heaviest coat. "Brutus is out there. The whole breeding program depends on him. You'll die in the first 100 yards. Celine grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Wind chill is 40 below. Visibility is 0. You can't rescue anyone if you're dead." But Kaiser was already at the door, his body language speaking volumes. The dog's military training had fully awakened now, overriding 3 years of trauma. With the simple understanding that soldiers were missing in action. His duty was clear, even if the mission seemed impossible. "He wants to go," Brock said, watching Kaiser's focused intensity. "He knows something we don't." "Dogs don't have magical powers," Celine replied, but her voice carried uncertainty. "They just have better senses than we do." Outside, the storm reached a new level of ferocity. Snow fell horizontally, driven by winds that turned each flake into a stinging projectile. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour, and weather reports, when they could get through, spoke of conditions that hadn't been seen in Northern California in recorded history. At 4 a.m., they tried to mount a rescue effort. Brock, Celine, and 2 neighbors who had stayed to help ventured 50 yards from the barn before the wind drove them back, faces raw with cold, lungs burning from the effort of breathing air that felt like liquid nitrogen. "It's no use," Jim Carlson gasped, ice forming in his beard. "We can't even stay upright out there. Those cattle are on their own until this passes." Inside the barn, Kaiser paced with growing agitation. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds humans couldn't hear over the storm's roar. Occasionally he would stop at the door, nose pressed to the crack, inhaling information that his brain processed with combat-trained efficiency. Bella tried to comfort him, pressing her warm body against his side, but Kaiser's focus remained absolute. Somewhere in the white hell beyond the barn, animals were dying. His pack was scattered and vulnerable. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to act. By dawn, the storm had isolated them completely. No power, no communications, no way to call for help or coordinate with other ranchers. The world had shrunk to the size of their barn and the 17 cattle they'd managed to save, but in the growing light that filtered through the snow, they could see the truth written in hoofprints that led into nothingness. Brutus and 30. Head of cattle had vanished into a blizzard that showed no signs of mercy. And Kaiser, for the first time since coming home from war, looked ready to complete a mission that might cost him everything. Kaiser's breathing changed first. Brock noticed it during the long, helpless hours after dawn when the storm showed no mercy, and the missing cattle remained ghosts in the white void. The German shepherd's respirations had shifted from the shallow panting of anxiety to the deep, controlled rhythm of a soldier preparing for combat. The dog sat motionless by the barn door, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond human perception. Snow continued to fall in sheets so thick they created their own weather system, turning the familiar ranch into an alien landscape where direction meant nothing and distance was measured in heartbeats rather than yards. Inside Kaiser's mind, two wars were fighting. The first was Afghanistan, July 2021, Kandahar province. The IED explosion that killed Martinez and Johnson while he lay helpless under twisted metal, watching his pack die while he lived. The weight of survivor's guilt that had crushed him for 3 years, the certainty that he should have detected the bomb sooner, should have barked louder, should have died instead of watching good soldiers become memories. The second war was here, now in the barn where 17 terrified cattle pressed against each other for warmth, while 30 of their herdmates faced death in conditions no living thing was meant to endure. Brutus was out there, the gentle giant who had become the heart of this place, the anchor that kept the other animals calm, the future of everything Frank Mitchell had built. Kaiser's military conditioning recognized the situation. With crystal clarity, soldiers were missing in action. His pack was scattered and vulnerable. The mission parameters were simple: locate, extract, survive. But the trauma responses fought back. Every fiber of his being that had learned to associate crisis with loss, duty with death, screamed at him to stay hidden, stay safe, let someone else pay the price this time. Bella sensed his internal struggle. The border collie moved closer, pressing her warm flank against his side, offering the kind of wordless support that only animals truly understood. Her presence didn't diminish his conflict, but it reminded him that he wasn't alone in it. "He's fighting himself," Celine observed quietly, watching Kaiser's ears twitch between forward alertness and backward anxiety. "Look at his body language. He wants to go, but something's holding him back." Brock knew exactly what was holding him back. The same thing that woke them both screaming at 3 a.m. The same thing that made backfiring trucks into artillery rounds and crowded spaces into kill zones. The weight of watching others die while you lived. "It's not his job anymore," Brock said. More to himself than to Celine. "He's done enough. He's earned the right to stay safe." But Kaiser's head turned at the words, dark eyes meeting Brock's with an intelligence that cut through species barriers. In that gaze, Brock saw something he recognized from his own mirror, the terrible understanding that safety was an illusion when others were dying, that peace was impossible when duty called. The memories came flooding back then, not in the jagged fragments of PTSD, but in the clear, purposeful recall of professional training. Kaiser remembered the search and rescue exercises in Georgia, before deployment when he'd learned to follow scent trails through impossible terrain. He remembered finding Corporal Williams buried under rubble in Helmand Province, alive because Kaiser had refused to give up when human searchers had called off the effort. He remembered the weight of Martinez's hand on his head the night before the IED, the quiet words, "Good boy, Kaiser. We're counting on you to bring us all home." He hadn't brought them all home. But maybe, in this white hell that had swallowed 30 cattle and one irreplaceable bull, he could finish what he'd started. Kaiser stood, his movement decisive rather than anxious. He walked to where his winter gear hung on a peg, the thick booties Brock had bought to protect his paws from ice, the reflective vest that would make him visible in low light conditions. His message was clear. He was going on mission. "No." Brock's voice carried the authority of a commanding officer, but Kaiser had moved beyond the hierarchy of human and dog. He was operating now on the level of soldier and soldier, professional. And professional. Kaiser, I said no, stay. The German shepherd looked at him with something approaching pity. Humans, his expression seemed to say, always made the mistake of thinking courage was about not being afraid. Real courage was about being afraid and going anyway, because lives depended on it. Bella moved to Kaiser's other side, her body language shifting from comfort to support. She understood what was happening better than the humans did. This wasn't recklessness or trauma response. This was Kaiser choosing to be who he'd been trained to be, a professional who brought missing soldiers home. Outside, the storm intensified with a fury that seemed personal. Wind speeds reached levels that could knock a grown man unconscious. Snow accumulated in drifts that could bury a truck. The temperature continued its deadly descent toward numbers that meant hypothermia in minutes and death in hours. But Kaiser's fear was transforming. Where anxiety had been, purpose took root. Where trauma had created avoidance, training built determination. His military conditioning was overriding 3 years of civilian safety, reminding him that some things were worth the risk of everything. He padded to the barn door and sat, his posture erect and alert, waiting, not asking permission, but giving. His human pack leader the opportunity to understand what was about to happen. In the growing silence, broken only by the storm's howl and the nervous shifting of the remaining cattle, Kaiser made his choice. He would go into the white. He would find Brutus and as many of the scattered herd as possible. He would bring them home or die trying, because that's what soldiers did for their pack. The trauma would always be there, a scar across his soul that 3 years of civilian life couldn't erase. But scars were proof of survival, not badges of defeat. And right now, survival meant action. Kaiser was done hiding. The mission was calling. And for the first time since Afghanistan, he was ready to answer. Kaiser slipped through the barn door at 3:47 a.m. while Brock dozed fitfully against a hay bale, and Celine checked on the remaining cattle. The German shepherd moved with the ghost-quiet precision of his military training, each paw placed deliberately to avoid the creaking boards that might alert his human pack to what he was about to attempt. The storm hit him like a physical wall. Wind speeds that the Weather Service would later record at 82 miles per hour drove snow horizontally with enough force to blind and disorient any creature foolish enough to venture into its path. The temperature had dropped to 14 below zero, with wind chills approaching 60 below numbers that turned exposed flesh into frostbite in under 2 minutes. But Kaiser's body had been conditioned for this. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to function in extreme conditions, to push past physical discomfort and focus on mission objectives. His thick double coat, bred for centuries to protect German shepherds in harsh climates, became armor against the cold. The protective booties Brock had fitted him with gripped the ice-covered ground, giving him purchase where human feet would have failed instantly. He paused at the edge of the ranch yard, lifting his nose to test the air. The storm carried a chaos of scents, pine needles torn from distant trees, the metallic tang of lightning, the deep earthiness of snow that had traveled hundreds of miles. But underneath it all, faint as a whisper, he caught the trail he sought, the distinctive musk of frightened cattle, their adrenaline-spiked scent cutting through the storm's white noise. The trail led north, toward the ravine system that cut through the hills like surgical scars. Kaiser's military training kicked in automatically, his mind cataloging terrain features, wind patterns, and escape routes with the methodical precision of a professional. This wasn't panic or heroic impulse. This was a soldier executing a search and rescue operation under combat conditions. The first 100 yards nearly killed him. Snow had drifted to depths that forced him to leap and burrow alternately, each movement burning precious energy reserves. The wind caught him broadside twice, tumbling him into drifts so deep he had to claw his way to the surface like a swimmer fighting for air. His breathing became labored, each inhalation feeling like swallowing ice. But he pressed forward, following the fading scent trail with the dogged determination that had made him legendary among his military unit. Kaiser had never failed to find what he was looking for. Not in the rubble of bombed buildings in Kandahar. Not in the maze of caves where insurgents hid their weapons caches. And not here, where 30 cattle and one irreplaceable bull fought for survival in conditions that were testing the limits of what flesh and blood could endure. The trail split at the first ravine. Kaiser paused, his tactical mind processing the options. The main group had gone left, following the easier path along the ridge. But a smaller scent signature deeper, more distinct led right, down into the ravine itself where the wind would be less, but the snow would accumulate in deadly depths. Brutus, the bull, had separated from his herd, either driven by panic or by some instinct to lead the predators away from the smaller animals. It was exactly what Kaiser would have done, what he had done countless times. Drawing enemy fire away from his human pack, the decision was automatic. Kaiser followed the lone trail into the ravine. The descent was a controlled fall down a slope that had become a 60-degree sheet of ice. Kaiser used his claws like pitons, finding purchase on buried rocks and fallen logs, his military training adapting mountain warfare techniques to this frozen hellscape. Twice he slipped, tumbling 20 feet through snow so deep it muffled his landing like a pillow made of needles. In the ravine's bottom, the wind eased but the snow lay in drifts 15 feet deep. Kaiser was forced to tunnel, his powerful shoulders driving him through walls of white that collapsed behind him like frozen avalanches. His body temperature began to drop despite his exertion, the first warning signs of hypothermia creeping into his consciousness. But the scent trail was stronger here, more recent. Brutus had passed this way within the last few hours, his massive hooves leaving depressions that the storm hadn't yet completely erased. The bull was moving erratically, his path showing the wandering confusion of an animal pushed beyond its limits by cold and exhaustion. Kaiser found the first sign of real trouble at a creek crossing. The water, normally a gentle stream, had become a raging torrent of snowmelt and storm runoff. Ice shelves jutted from both banks like broken teeth, and the current ran black and fast enough to sweep away anything that fell into its grip. Brutus had tried to cross. His hoofprints led to the bank's edge, then disappeared. On the far side, more tracks emerged from the water, but they were unsteady, weaving. The gait of an animal fighting hypothermia and exhaustion. Kaiser didn't hesitate. Military working dogs were trained for water rescues, had practiced river crossings in conditions almost as dangerous as this. He launched himself into the current, his powerful swimming stroke carrying him across the 20-foot gap in seconds. That felt like hours. The water was so cold it drove the breath from his lungs, but he reached the far bank and hauled himself out, ice forming instantly on his coat. The trail was clearer now, more desperate. Brutus was weakening, his stride shortening, his path becoming more erratic. Kaiser could smell the bull's distress, the sharp chemical signature of an animal pushed to its absolute limits. And then, through the storm's howl, he heard it, a low, rumbling sound that was part moan, part cry for help. Brutus was calling for his herd, for help, for anything that might answer in this white wilderness that had become his tomb. Kaiser triangulated the sound with the precision of his military training, adjusting his course toward what he hoped would be salvation rather than just another casualty of the storm's merciless hunger. The mission was entering its most critical phase, and both rescuer and victim were running out of time. Kaiser found Brutus at 5:23 a.m., buried alive under a snowdrift that had claimed the massive bull like a white grave. Only the tip of one horn protruded from the accumulated snow, a dark spike against the endless white that might have been mistaken for a broken branch, if not for the faint condensation of breath that still escaped from somewhere beneath. The German SHephard's military training took over immediately. This was a live burial scenario, the kind of emergency that required systematic excavation techniques and absolute precision. Every second mattered. Every movement had to count. One wrong dig could cause a collapse that would finish what the storm had started. Kaiser began at the horn, using his powerful claws to carefully scrape away snow in a controlled spiral pattern. The accumulated drift was packed solid by wind pressure, each layer compressed into ice-hard barriers that resisted his efforts like concrete. His paws began to bleed within minutes, the protective booties shredded by the relentless digging. But he didn't slow down. Beneath the snow, Brutus was barely conscious. The 2,000-pound bull had been trapped for over 3 hours, his body heat creating a small air pocket that was the only thing keeping him alive. But hypothermia was winning the battle, his massive heart slowing with each degree his core. Temperature dropped. His breathing had become shallow, erratic, the kind of rhythm that preceded system shutdown. Kaiser dug with the desperate efficiency of a soldier defusing a bomb. His military training had included scenarios exactly like this: collapsed buildings in earthquake zones, avalanche rescues in mountain warfare, excavating wounded comrades from rubble before insurgent mortar rounds could find their range. But those exercises had been conducted with human backup, proper equipment, and the knowledge that medical support was minutes away. Here, he was alone. The storm hadn't lessened. If anything, it seemed to intensify, as if sensing that life was fighting back against its dominance. Wind speeds that could knock a man unconscious drove snow into Kaiser's excavation site faster than he could clear it. Twice, his carefully constructed access tunnel collapsed, forcing him to start over from different angles. His body temperature was dropping dangerously. The exertion kept his core warm, but his extremities, paws, ears, nose, were beginning to show signs of frostbite. Ice formed in his fur, weighing him down, making each movement more difficult. His breathing became labored, each inhalation burning his lungs with cold that felt like liquid nitrogen. But Kaiser had been trained for this too. Pain was information, not instruction. Discomfort was data, not defeat. His conditioning from 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to compartmentalize physical distress, to function through levels of exhaustion that would incapacitate civilians. He reached Brutus's head after 47 minutes of digging. The bull's eyes were closed, his massive head resting against the snow wall at an angle that suggested unconsciousness. But when Kaiser's nose touched the animal's muzzle, Brutus's eyes fluttered open, deep brown orbs, filled with the kind of weary recognition that passed between soldiers who understood they were both fighting the same war. The bull tried to lift. His head failed, tried again. His movements were sluggish, uncoordinated, the motor responses of an animal whose system was shutting down from cold. But there was still intelligence there, still awareness, still the gentle spirit that had made him the heart of Frank Mitchell's herd. Kaiser began the systematic excavation of Brutus's body, working from head to shoulders to torso with the methodical precision of military engineering. The bull was buried deeper than Kaiser had initially realized. The drift extended down 8 feet, and Brutus's position suggested he had been walking when the snow collapse occurred, trapping him in a standing position with no leverage to dig himself free. As Kaiser worked, exposing more of the bull's body, Brutus began to respond. The animal's survival instincts, dormant during the hours of entrapment, reawakened as he felt the weight of snow lessening on his massive frame. He began to move his legs, testing his strength, adding his own efforts to the rescue operation. The partnership that formed in that frozen excavation site transcended species barriers. Kaiser would dig furiously for 10 minutes, clearing snow from around Brutus's shoulders and front legs. Then the bull would use his recovered mobility to push upward, creating space for Kaiser to access new areas of entrapment. It was a dance of mutual survival, each animal contributing what they could to their shared escape from the storm's white prison. By the time Kaiser had cleared enough snow for Brutus to attempt standing, both animals were running on reserves. they didn't know they possessed. Kaiser's paws were raw and bleeding, leaving red stains on the snow that marked his trail of effort. Brutus's legs shook with the effort of supporting his massive weight after hours of immobility, his movements unsteady but determined. The bull struggled to his feet, snow cascading from his body like an avalanche in reverse. He stood on unsteady legs, looking down at the German shepherd who had literally dug him out of his grave. Then something passed between them that had nothing to do with predator and prey. Domesticated and wild, human influence and animal instinct. It was recognition. Soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor. Two beings who had looked death in the face and decided they weren't ready to surrender. But the storm wasn't finished with them. Standing in the bottom of the ravine, both animals realized that extraction was only the first phase of their survival challenge. They were miles from the ranch, in conditions that were still lethal, both weakened by their ordeal and facing a journey that would test everything they had learned about endurance, partnership, and refusing to give up when everything seemed lost. Kaiser looked up at Brutus, then toward the white chaos that surrounded them. The bull followed his gaze, understanding instinctively that their fight for survival had only just begun. Together, they turned toward home, two unlikely allies beginning the most dangerous journey of their lives. The journey back to the ranch became a test of endurance that pushed both animals beyond what their bodies were designed to survive. Kaiser took point, his military navigation training helping him plot the safest route through terrain that had been transformed into an alien landscape of drifts, ice walls, and hidden ravines that could swallow them both without trace. Brutus followed 20 feet behind, his massive hooves finding purchase where Kaiser's smaller paws had tested the ground first. The bull's breathing came in labored clouds that froze instantly in the sub-zero air, his movements still unsteady from hours of entrapment, but growing stronger with each step. His survival instincts, honed by generations of cattle who had endured harsh winters, were fully engaged now. The storm showed signs of weakening, but that brought its own dangers. Improved visibility revealed the true scope of the devastation around them. Trees snapped like toothpicks, power lines down, and snowdrifts that had reshaped the familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. What had been a gentle valley was now a series of white canyons and ice-covered obstacles that turned every 100 yards into a tactical problem. Kaiser's military training proved invaluable as they navigated the treacherous terrain. He used techniques learned in mountain warfare, testing each step before committing his weight, reading the snow conditions for signs of instability, plotting routes that offered cover from the wind while avoiding the deepest accumulations. His paws were numb with cold, despite the constant movement, but he maintained the methodical pace that would get them both home alive. 20 minutes into their journey, they encountered their first major obstacle, a creek that had become a raging torrent of black water and broken ice. The normal crossing point was obliterated by a logjam of debris that turned the gentle stream into a violent chaos of currents and ice shelves. Kaiser approached the water's edge cautiously, his nose testing the air for safer crossing points upstream or down. Brutus waited patiently, his huge head lowered against the wind, trusting the German shepherd's tactical assessment with the kind of faith that only emerged from shared survival experiences. The dog found a narrow point where a fallen tree created a natural bridge, but it was barely wide enough for his own passage, let alone the bull's massive frame. Kaiser crossed first, testing the log's stability, then barked a specific pattern 3 short, too long that his military training had ingrained as "follow me, safe passage confirmed." Brutus approached the makeshift bridge with surprising grace for an animal his size. 2,000 pounds of muscle and bone moved across the ice-slicked log with the careful precision of a tightrope walker, his hooves finding purchase on bark that threatened to crumble with each step. Halfway across, the log shifted under his weight, groaning like a living thing. But the bull maintained his balance and completed the crossing without the catastrophic fall that would have ended their journey before it truly began. As they climbed out of the creek bottom, both animals were showing signs of severe exhaustion. Kaiser's gait had developed a slight limp. His left rear paw was injured from the digging, possibly a torn pad or stressed tendon. Brutus's breathing was becoming more labored, his massive heart working overtime to pump blood through a body that was fighting hypothermia with every beat. But they pressed on, driven by the kind of determination that transcended species barriers. Kaiser would stop every few hundred yards to allow Brutus to rest, the dog's tactical mind calculating energy expenditure against distance remaining. The bull would use these breaks to paw through snow, searching for any vegetation that might provide calories for the journey ahead, his farmer's instincts telling him that fuel was as important as shelter in a survival situation. The wind began to shift as afternoon approached, bringing the first hints that the storm system was finally moving on. But with the change came new challenges. The temperature dropped even further as clear skies allowed heat to radiate away from the earth, creating conditions that turned their breath into ice crystals before it could dissipate. Kaiser's military training included cold weather survival techniques, but those had assumed human support, proper equipment, and the ability to create shelter when needed. Here, shelter meant movement, and movement meant burning energy reserves that both animals could ill afford to lose. They encountered evidence of the scattered herd 3 hours into their journey, hoofprints in the snow, scattered in all directions, telling the story of animals that had panicked completely when separated from their leader. Kaiser's nose told him that some had passed this way recently, heading in the general direction of the ranch, but others had wandered deeper into the hills where hypothermia would claim them before sunrise. Brutus lifted his massive head at the scent of his herd, a low rumble emerging from his chest that was part recognition, part sorrow. The gentle giant understood that his moment of panic had scattered the animals he was supposed to protect, and Kaiser could see the weight of that responsibility in the bull's eyes. The German shepherd moved closer to Brutus, pressing his smaller body against the bull's front leg in a gesture that transcended training or instinct. It was comfort, offered from one soldier to another, acknowledging that leadership meant carrying the burden of others, safety even when your own survival was in question. As the afternoon light began to fade, what little light penetrated the storm clouds, both animals could see the distant glow of the ranch buildings. Emergency generators had kept some power flowing, creating a beacon in the white wilderness that meant warmth, shelter, and the end of their ordeal. But they still had 2 miles to go. Their energy reserves were nearly depleted, and the night would bring temperatures that could kill them both before they reached safety. Kaiser looked up at Brutus, then toward the distant lights of home. The bull met his gaze with eyes that held no quit, no surrender, only the steady determination of an animal who had decided that some things were worth any sacrifice. Together, they took the first steps toward the final phase of their impossible journey. The barn lights grew larger with each exhausted step, but they seemed to recede as quickly as they approached, like mirages in a desert of white. Kaiser's military training had taught him about the psychological effects of extreme exhaustion, how the mind could play tricks when the body was pushed beyond its operational limits. But the lights were real, and home was less than half a mile away when his legs finally began to fail. The German shepherd stumbled first at 7:43 p.m., his injured paw giving out completely as he tried to navigate around a snow-covered fence post. He went down hard, his body hitting the packed snow with a sound that cut through the wind like a gunshot. For a moment he lay still, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that spoke of a system running on empty. Brutus stopped immediately. The massive bull turned his head toward his fallen companion, and something extraordinary happened. The animal that had spent the last 8 hours following Kaiser's lead took charge for the first time since their ordeal began. The bull moved to Kaiser's side and lowered his enormous head, gently nudging the dog with his nose. When Kaiser didn't respond immediately, Brutus did something that defied everything anyone thought they knew about cattle behavior. He lay down in the snow beside the German shepherd, positioning his massive body to create a windbreak and sharing his rapidly depleting body heat with the animal who had saved his life. For 20 minutes, they rested together in the snow, two species that evolution had never intended to be allies, bound together by the kind of experience that transcended natural barriers. Kaiser pressed against Brutus's warm flank, drawing strength from the bull's steady breathing and unshakable presence. The dog's military training told him that rest was a luxury they couldn't afford, but his exhausted body demanded the respite. As they lay together, the storm finally began to break. Gaps appeared in the cloud cover for the first time in 36 hours, allowing glimpses of stars that looked impossibly bright and cold. The wind dropped from hurricane force to merely dangerous, and visibility improved enough to reveal that the ranch buildings were closer than either animal had dared hope. Kaiser struggled to his feet, testing his injured paw against the snow. The pain was significant, but manageable soldier's pain, the kind that could be endured because the mission wasn't complete. Brutus rose beside him, his movements more steady now, his massive frame having recovered some strength during their brief rest. They could see figures moving around the barn now, silhouetted against the emergency lighting. Flashlight beams swept across the snow in systematic search patterns, and even through the wind, they could hear voices calling their names. Brock had organized a search party the moment the storm showed signs of weakening. Celine and Ariana Harris were working outward from the barn in carefully coordinated sweeps, connected by radio and rope lines to prevent anyone else from becoming lost in the deadly conditions. "I've got movement," Celine's voice crackled through the radio, her veterinarian's training helping her distinguish between wind-blown debris and living creatures. "Southwest quadrant, maybe 200 yards out, something big." Brock turned his flashlight in that direction and saw what looked impossible. Two figures moving together across the snow, one smaller and dark, one massive and pale. His heart stopped for a moment as his brain processed what his eyes were seeing. "Kaiser," he whispered, then shouted it loud enough to carry across the valley. "Kaiser! Brutus!" The German shepherd's head came up at the sound of his name, ears pricking forward despite his exhaustion. He found reserves of energy he didn't know he still possessed and began moving toward the voices with renewed purpose. Brutus followed, his hooves finding better purchase on the wind-packed snow, both animals drawn toward the light and warmth and safety that represented everything they had fought to reach. The reunion happened in slow motion, like a scene from a movie where heroes return from impossible missions. Brock dropped to his knees in the snow as Kaiser reached him, his hands running over the dog's body, checking for injuries, his voice breaking as he realized what his companion had accomplished. "You found him," Brock said, his words barely audible over the wind. "You actually found him and brought him home." Celine was already examining Brutus with her veterinarian's trained eye, her hands moving over the bull's body, checking for signs of frostbite, hypothermia, or injury. What she found defied medical explanation. An animal that should have been dead from exposure was tired and cold, but fundamentally sound, his vital signs stronger than she had any right to expect. "How is this possible?" she asked, looking between Kaiser and Brutus with something approaching awe. "They've been out there for over 12 hours in conditions that should have killed them both." Ariana Harris stood watching the scene with tears freezing on her cheeks. She had known Frank Mitchell for 40 years, had seen him work miracles with animals that others had given up on. But this surpassed anything even he had accomplished. "They saved each other," she said quietly. "That dog went out there to rescue the bull, but somewhere along the way they became partners. They kept each other alive." As they led Kaiser and Brutus back to the warmth of the barn, more figures emerged from the storm. Other cattle, scattered by the panic but drawn by some instinct toward the sound of home, began appearing out of the white darkness. Not all of them. 6 would never be found, claimed by the storm's merciless hunger, but enough to ensure the herd's survival and the ranch's future. Inside the barn, as Celine worked to treat both animals for hypothermia and exhaustion, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. Kaiser had not only survived his first crisis since returning from war, he had triumphed over it, transforming from a traumatized veteran into the professional soldier he had always been meant to be. And Brutus, the gentle giant whose loss would have meant the end of everything Frank Mitchell had built, stood in his stall munching hay as if leading a German shepherd through a blizzard was just another day's work. The storm was over, but its consequences would reshape everything they thought. They knew about courage, partnership, and the extraordinary things that happened when survival depended on refusing to give up on each other. Spring came early to the hills outside San Francisco, as if the earth itself was eager to heal from the winter that had tested everyone's limits. By April, the ranch that had been 3 months from foreclosure was thriving in ways that surprised even the most optimistic projections. The story of Kaiser and Brutus had spread throughout Northern California's ranching community, bringing visitors, volunteers, and opportunities that transformed the struggling operation into something Frank Mitchell could never have imagined. Kaiser stood in the morning sunlight, watching Bella work the herd with the efficient grace that had made border collies legendary among cattlemen. But now she had an assistant. The German shepherd had found his new mission in the months following the blizzard, becoming the ranch's unofficial search and rescue specialist. His trauma had been transformed into purpose, his hypervigilance becoming a professional asset rather than a psychological burden. The breakthrough had come in February, when a neighboring rancher's prize stallion had gone missing during a winter storm. Kaiser had found the horse within 4 hours, using the same systematic approach that had saved Brutus. Word spread quickly through the close-knit ranching community, and requests for Kaiser's services began arriving weekly. Brock watched from the porch as Kaiser moved among the cattle with quiet confidence, no longer the traumatized veteran who had hidden from backfiring trucks, but a professional who had found his calling in civilian life. The transformation had been gradual but complete, each successful rescue building on the last until the dog's PTSD symptoms had faded to manageable echoes rather than overwhelming episodes. "He's training another dog today," Celine announced, joining Brock on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. She wore an engagement ring now, a simple band that caught the morning light as she handed him his cup. Ariana's young German shepherd. Apparently, the rescue instinct is something that can be taught. The wedding was planned for June, a simple ceremony in the pasture where Kaiser had first learned to trust again. Celine had moved her veterinary practice to the ranch, establishing a clinic that served the entire valley while specializing in trauma recovery for working animals. Her reputation had grown alongside Kaiser's, creating a partnership that served both their professional ambitions and their shared commitment to healing. Brutus emerged from the barn, his massive frame moving with the unhurried dignity that had made him legendary among local ranchers. The bull had sired 12 calves since the storm, his gentle genetics ensuring that Frank Mitchell's breeding program would continue for generations. But more than that, he had become a symbol of resilience, proof that survival sometimes required accepting help from the most unexpected sources. The unlikely friendship between dog and bull had deepened over the months. They were often found together in the pasture, Kaiser resting in the shade of Brutus's massive frame, the bull seeming to take comfort in the German shepherd's presence. Visitors marveled at their bond, but for those who had witnessed their ordeal, it made perfect sense. They had saved each other in ways that transcended species, creating a connection that would endure for the rest of their lives. "The documentary crew wants to film the training session," Celine said, settling beside Brock on the wooden steps their grandfather had built 60 years earlier. National Geographic is calling it the partnership that saved a ranch. Brock smiled, remembering the morning 6 months ago when he had been ready to lose everything his grandfather had built. Now the ranch was expanding, with plans for a formal search and rescue training center that would teach both dogs and handlers the techniques that had proven so effective in Kaiser's missions. The financial pressures that had once seemed insurmountable had disappeared, replaced by income streams that Frank Mitchell could never have anticipated. Tour groups paid to meet the famous animals. Ranchers paid for Kaiser's services and training programs. Media companies paid for the rights to tell their story. The ranch that had been dying was now more vibrant than it had ever been. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was in the relationships that had grown from crisis, the community bonds that had been strengthened by shared adversity, and the understanding that healing often required the courage to help others, even when you were struggling yourself. Kaiser lifted his head as a truck backfired in the distance, the sound that had once sent him into hiding. Now he simply looked toward the noise, assessed it as non-threatening, and returned to his work. The dog who had once been broken by war had been healed by peace, finding his purpose not in forgetting his trauma but in using his experience to prevent others from suffering alone. As the morning sun climbed higher over the California hills, warming the earth that had been frozen by unprecedented winter, Brock Mitchell understood something his grandfather had tried to teach him years before. True wealth wasn't measured in what you accumulated, but in what you nurtured, what you protected, and what you were willing to risk everything to save. The ranch would endure, as it always had, through the partnership of those who understood that survival was a community effort, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances produce the most extraordinary results.